Well, this is a show we always like doing each year. Your chance to pose your questions to Alan, Andrew, Chantal, and Rex. They're all here for the last time this year and anxious to hear what's on your mind. So let's get at it. The most common question we got this year was about decorum in the House of Commons. Best summarized, I think, by this question that was sent in by video. Watch this.
Hi, I'm Pascal Zamprelli in Montreal. Voter apathy is on the rise, in large part because of the behavior in the House of Commons. What New Year's resolutions do you have to suggest to our members of Parliament?
All right, good question from Pascal. Andrew, why don't you start us? Maybe just one New Year's resolution.
Well, the worst part of it is that the civility is the least of our troubles, really, politically, but it certainly is one of them. I think it's a manifestation of powerlessness, frankly. When people have no responsible job to do as MPs, then they act up. If they have a feeling of dignity and self-respect, they're less likely to behave that way. If you want a really concrete, practical solution, however, move the benches closer together. If you watch the British Parliament, it's much better than ours, and one reason, only one reason, is it's much harder to barrack somebody if they're 3 feet away from you than if they're 20 feet. You notice in the Prime Minister and presidential debates, the election debates, when you get them to sit down at the desk together, everything calms down quite a bit, and that would be one small suggestion.
Yeah, it's not always calm in the British House of Commons.
But it's comparatively.
Yeah, interesting. Alan?
The resolution should be don't be a jackass. And there's evidence that there are actually some politicians in North America right now are getting this message. There was 2 candidates in Connecticut who basically had a pact where they would be civil. They would never say anything bad about the other one, only something positive about what they had to say, and that was their test. Are they being a jackass or not? And they invited the electorate to punish them. If they were, and they ran an entire campaign that way. And they had,
well, there's legitimate criticism. I mean, I think it's a question of tone. I don't have any problem with somebody saying my opponent's policies would be wrong for this, and this reason.
Chantal?
Well, in question period, take the Prime Minister out of the mix most days of the week and allow ministers to answer questions rather than have a puppet master do it for them, in this case the House Leader John Barrett. But at the end of the day, Parliament is relevant when it debates things that are relevant to Canadians. Talking about, patriation of the Constitution, free trade, abortion rights, people paid attention. If you give Parliament nothing relevant to debate, you're not going to get a really interesting debate.
Rex?
I don't know if I have a resolution to offer, but I think the source of the dilemma is not actually in the Commons or in the seating in the Commons. It's caucuses. Anyone who's ever sat in a caucus, it's a very peculiar psychology. And before they're let loose, either to the press or to the Commons, that particular stream of adrenaline and the partisanship that gets welded within a caucus room, that's the source of all the wild emotion and occasionally extremely extravagant behavior. Our questioner, though, is right. It is civility and the conduct of politicians, verbally and otherwise, that really is hurting the process of politics.
All right. You should make the point, though, that Michael Chong had an entire raft of proposals forward to add some civility in the House that they've never fully acted upon.
Chong's the Conservative MP, was in Cabinet, resigned on a matter of principle, and has made a name for himself with his recommendations, but nobody's picking them up.
Well, it's in front of a committee right now, I believe.
Okay, we'll see how far they go. Kevin Peters, Steinbach, Manitoba, writes, we have had a more Western-based party in power for nearly 5 years now. An old slogan of Western alienation has been, the West wants in. Are Westerners in now? Alan?
Definitely. Absolutely. The nature of Western Canadian alienation has changed tremendously over the years. Historically, what it was that Toronto has everything. More contemporarily, what it is that Toronto doesn't have everything. We have a major contribution to make, and we want to have a larger voice for that reason. And I don't think there's any question that you look at, who some of the major politicians in this country are today, who have major influences, and that the Western Canadians are right among them.
Chantal?
Yes and no, in the sense that, yes, the Conservatives are in power and Western Canada is represented, but we still have 2 national parties, but one in particular, the Liberals, that is relatively absent from Western Canada, and I don't think that the West can really be in Ottawa if it's all in or all out. Remember the parliamentary crisis of the coalition that come about? Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta almost entirely would have been in opposition overnight. And that goes to the fact that our national parties are not that national anymore.
Rex?
I think I agree with you that it's both, but there's been a big improvement. I remember being within 2 days when Preston Manning finally became the leader of the opposition. And I happened to be in Calgary within 2 days of that, and boy, what a big deal it was. Secondly, the economics speak to how much the West is in besides the politics. I've spoken about Newfoundland and the East Coast, all the jobs we got because when the fishery went down. And secondly, most people know that the engine of this country is not only in Ontario anymore, so they are there. But I'll go to the final point that Chantal is implying. We still have in this country a real problem of cohesion and coherence at the national level. We are blocks. And the West, when it wants to, can go back into that block very quickly and sunder those ties that have been built up in the last little while.
Andrew.
Whether the West is in now, it is certainly going to be increasingly in the future. The money, the population, and the power are all shifting west. If you go back to 1980 when the National Energy Program was brought in, Quebec and Western Canada had roughly the same number of seats. Well, you have the same population now in BC and Alberta alone compared to Quebec. They have a larger GDP now than Ontario does, the West as a total. I think there's going to be a challenge for the West because the West's political culture has been traditionally very oppositional. They were the party of the outs.
Absolutely.
Because, in the past century, you had to get Quebec to win a majority. In the coming century, if you don't win a majority of the seats in the West, you are not going to form a majority government in this country. The West's going to have to figure out, okay, now that we're running the place, what does that mean?
And under redistribution, they'll even get more seats.
Yeah.
Nova Scotia sends this one in. Wade Thibault in Liscombe. Our youth have great passion for issues like the economy, environment, and many others. Do you think Canadians as young as 16 should be given the right to vote? I like this question. Chantal.
I'm not convinced, but I don't have a firm position one way or the other. I just note that people as young as 18 have the right to vote, and they are amongst the least assiduous voters. So, and if young people did vote, the 18 to 25 in the same numbers as people our age do, you would see the agenda change on the basis of the fact that they do vote. So I'm not sure bringing it down to 16 would do very much, except force politicians to spend more time in high schools.
Well, what I like about it is that's the generation, that age group, 16, 18, is the most connected anywhere because of social media and other things. They're talking.
Well, but Chantal does make the point. I mean, voter turnout among 18 to 24 is horrendous. I mean, it's in the 20%. So simply extending the vote to 16-year-olds, I don't think is going to do anything because politics, by and large, isn't relevant to them. I think we have to do is we have to find.
Could this make it relevant?
Well, not just the vote, because I think the vote is probably not that material in terms of changing. We can talk about that also in terms of some e-democracy stuff. But that engaging our young people much, much more in our civic culture, I think, is incredibly important, and that we should be doing that. I think that programs like Katimavik, the old Canadian University Students Overseas, offering the prospect of doing serious volunteerism around environmental issues and these other sort of things are legitimate government programs that we should be doing to try to bring young people more involved in the community and through that more involved in politics.
All right, well, this one's directed right at you, Alan. It comes from Bloomfield, New Brunswick, Sylvia Arbo, and it's connected. If electoral voting can be accomplished using the internet, would this be a significantly positive contribution to the democratic process?
Well, yes, and it would only be part. I mean, when you think about it, is we use technology to empower ourselves to do everything now. If I want my money out of my bank, I can get it any time I want. If I want to have a movie, I can see it any time I want. In democracy, once every 4 years, we're given a piece of blank paper and a HB pencil and invited to put an X on it. I mean, it's no wonder people think that voting isn't particularly important. We should be harnessing technology to draw people closer to policy making, wiki policy, these sorts of things, and using e-democracy to actually make politics relevant again to the population, especially that younger cohort.
All right, we got a video question here, and it comes, well, let's have the person identify themselves. This one's directed to
Glenn, I'm in
Andrew.
Ottawa. My question's pretty simple. Given decreasing voter turnout, what do you think about mandatory voting with the option of a blank vote?
Andrew.
Well, I'm in favor of mandatory voting. You have the right to decline the ballot. You have the right to spoil your ballot. You have the right to vote none of the above. I don't think you should have the right to just sit on your duff. It doesn't have to mean you throw them in jail. You can have positive incentives. I will say, however, that's a much more positive result than lowering the voting age, which is a ghastly idea. Have you met the average 16-year-old? And to say that we should have electronic voting. Voting is an important act. There should be ritual and theater associated with it. You should go to the polling booth and mark your X on that antiquated piece of paper. There's a difference between going to church and watching church on TV.
There is another. I'll pick up on some of what Andrew says. I do think that when we hear, for example, the Facebook petitions, the facility with which electronic communication allows you to amass opinion in, say, 20 minutes without exertion and without the efforts of persuasion that old-fashioned methods imposed upon you, I'm not so sure yet we've measured what is actually the nature of sentiment when it is expressed in certain cases by coagulations on the new social media. Secondly, I agree with you on one very strong point. I think we should attach something like a liturgy to the seriousness of this particular event, this particular action that links us to the system that we support and that supports us. So I wouldn't make it too easy, but I certainly would never mandate forced voting. Your conscience should be the only force you need in this.
Works in Australia. It's like jury duty.
I don't know what the average 16-year-old is like, just like I don't know what the average 85-year-old who has the right to vote
anything,
is
we
like.
should raise
However,
the age.
I'll tell you, this past summer, I spent a week with 70 16 and 17-year-olds, mostly from Canada, some from elsewhere in the world, in the Arctic, studying all kinds of things. And they were among the brightest group of people I've ever spent time with. And they're,
and the irony is that they're also very socially engaged. They're just not politically engaged. And if we could take that interest in the world and tell them that the vehicle through which you actually change the world is politics, for good or ill. Government isn't them, it's us. That's how we choose to organize ourselves. And that message has not got through to that generation.
Well, how could it when us as voters are not convinced of your proposition? How many voters who are religious about voting believe really that that is how you exact change, considering the kind of politics we've been having for the past decade or so?
You disbelieve it at your peril,
But,
though.
no, possibly you disbelieve it at your peril, but it's very hard to convince young people that something is true when it isn't.
In a perfect world, the voting age would be 35, but I'm willing to settle for 21.
when do you cut it off?
35 and
we cut people off from driving because they don't have the basic skills still needed.
It's true.
And that can be for any number of reasons.
But I certainly wouldn't put a flat age limit, because what is absolutely true is no 5-year-old can reason enough to vote. Some 85-year-olds can't. So it's worthwhile to have an age gap at the bottom, or an age line at the bottom. I wouldn't propose one at the top.
And a property qualification. We should have that.
Okay, I got to take a break. Let me try and quickly get this one in. Truth in advertising is a law in this country that applies to companies. Why does this not apply to politicians? Jerry Manley, Edmonton, Alberta. Good question. Andrew.
Yeah, and I agree with it up to a point. I don't think you want to be playing gotcha with every stray slip of the lip on the campaign trail. But the problem we have now is not so much that people are lying and getting away with it, although they are. It's that things have come to such a pass now that even if somebody's telling the truth, nobody believes them. So what we do need, I think, is for some way for politicians to really and ultimately demonstrate the way that we do in other walks of life, bonding, swearing an oath. Why could you not have a provision of the election law where a politician could say, in releasing my platform today, I invoke Article 9 of the Elections Act, and Article 9 of the Elections Act would set out some kind of consequence, some legal consequence that would follow if they were just making it up. I don't see why we make a special exception for that kind of very deliberate act, as opposed, as I say, to sort of playing gotcha with stray remarks.
What kind of bonding were you talking about then?
The bonded courier, you know.
Yes, of course. Chantal.
There is no arbiter of truth, and truth is not universal. There is not one truth, so I don't find any of this suggestion of truth in advertising that it applies to the political debate, that it applies to the first task of politicians, which is not to make promises and fulfill them, but to build consensus and move society forward. And sometimes, yes, back off, because what you promised in opposition was not borne out by the reality that you find in government. Where I find that politicians fail us is in not admitting this and backing off and saying, well, I'm not going backwards, you're dreaming. That's where the problems are. But to have someone who's going to decide.
I'm going to decide.
Okay, good luck.
Well, the political parties do have to submit their advertising to the Electoral Commission for approval, and if it's blatantly false, they're not allowed. I mean, the internet creates a whole other prospect for mischief, however, that we haven't figured out how to regulate.
Okay, we've got to take a break. So hold that thought, Rex. More of your questions still to come, but first a break.